87. That is how many giant stone statues, one small island, smaller than a mid-sized city, carved from volcanic rock, by hand, with no wheels, no metal tools, and no draft animals. Picture carving nearly 1,000 statues as tall as a 3-story building, then dragging them for miles across an island that didn't have a single tree left to make rope from. This is Easter Island, the most isolated inhabited place on Earth, more than 700 kilometers from the nearest continent, so remote that astronauts on the International Space Station are sometimes physically closer to land than the people who live here. What drove a small society in the middle of the ocean to pour everything it had into building these giants, and what happened when the bill for that ambition finally came due? Easter Island isn't really one island. It's 3 long-extinct volcanoes, born from the Pacific seafloor hundreds of thousands of years ago, that eventually fused together through cooling lava flows into a small triangle of land barely 160 square kilometers wide. Small enough that you could walk around the entire perimeter in a single day. People didn't come here for fertile soil. It was the island's total isolation that shaped everything that followed. No neighboring island to trade with, nowhere to flee if resources ran out. The island's first paradox wasn't scarcity, it was early abundance. When the first humans arrived, they didn't find a barren rock. They found a dense, subtropical forest, dominated by a now-extinct giant palm species, large enough to build ocean-going canoes and tall enough to reach nearly 30 meters. That very forest, which looked like a gift from nature, would become a slow-fused bomb for every generation that came after. Climate played its own part in the story. Rapa Nui sits in the subtropics without the sharply defined dry season many other Pacific islands have, but trade winds blow year-round, and once the vegetation cover disappeared, they scoured the soil relentlessly. Unlike Hawaii or Tahiti, whose tall mountains catch constant rainfall, Rapa Nui's 3 volcanoes are simply too low to create that effect, leaving this island, despite sitting in the middle of a vast ocean, chronically short on fresh water in a way few people would expect just from looking at a small green dot on a map of the Pacific. According to Rapa Nui oral tradition, a chief named Hotu Matua led a group of around 100 settlers across thousands of kilometers of open ocean, possibly from the Marquesas Islands, to reach this island somewhere between 700 and 1000 AD. This was no accidental drift voyage. It was a deliberate expedition built on some of the most sophisticated maritime knowledge in the ancient world, navigating by stars, swell patterns, and the flight paths of birds across an ocean with no landmarks at all. It wasn't luck that found this island in the middle of nowhere. It was a navigation system so advanced that much of the rest of the world wouldn't understand its principles for centuries. The first settlers called their new home Rapa Nui, Great Rapa, or Tepito Tehenua, the navel of the world. From a small founding group, the population grew and split into clans, each with its own name, each controlling a strip of land running from the coast into the interior. The Miru clan, the direct descendants of Hotu Matua, held the highest rank in this hierarchy. It was competition between these clans, not religion alone, that gave rise to the Moai tradition. Each clan raised statues of its own ancestors, taller and grander than its neighbors, turning stone, carving into a centuries-long, silent arms race for status. Almost every Moai was carved from a single quarry, Rano Raraku, where hundreds of unfinished statues still sit, half attached to the rock face today, as if the carvers simply stopped working one day and never came back. For decades, the biggest question about this island wasn't who carved the statues, but how a society with no wheels moved stones weighing up to 86 tons for miles across rugged terrain. For generations, the Rapa Nui themselves insisted on one answer: the statues walked. Archaeologists long dismissed this as legend, until researchers Carl Lipo and Terry Hunt built a replica Moai weighing over 4 tons and proved that with just 18 people and a few ropes, they could rock the statue side to side in a zigzag motion and make it walk forward exactly as the oral tradition had claimed all along. It wasn't a lack of technology that made these statues feel like magic. It was technology so elegantly simple that no one outside the people who built it ever remembered the trick. But the quarry story has a lesser-known detail: the cylindrical red hats that top some Moai called pukao didn't come from Rano Raraku at all, but from an entirely separate quarry, Punapau, the island's only source of that distinctive red volcanic scoria. That meant finishing a single statue required coordinating the extraction and transport of materials from 2 separate quarries, then figuring out how to lift a multi-ton stone cylinder onto the top of a statue already taller than a 10-meter building. The red color wasn't incidental in Rapa Nui culture. Red symbolized the most sacred things, and mana, the spiritual power of the elite. It wasn't a lack of local material that sent them searching for red stone so far away. It's that to them, a statue without that hat still wasn't spiritually complete, even if its form was finished. On April 5th, 1722, Easter Sunday, Dutch Admiral Jacob Roggeveen became the first European to sight the island, giving it the name the outside world still uses today. But what Roggeveen recorded in his log is the more telling detail. He described an island almost entirely stripped of trees, a stark contrast to the dense forest that the settlers' ancestors had found there 7 centuries earlier. His crew estimated the island's population at a few thousand people scattered across small coastal villages, living in the shadow of giant statues whose own origins even they could no longer fully explain. Not every statue on the island looks out to sea. At Ahu Akivi, deep in the interior, 7 identical Moai stand facing straight out toward the ocean, the only place on the entire island where this happens. Legend says the 7 statues represent 7 explorers sent ahead by King Hotu Matua to find the land his advisor had seen in a dream. But archaeoastronomers found something even more precise. The 7 statues are aligned to face directly toward the point where the sun sets during the spring equinox, and to have their backs to the sunrise on the autumn equinox. It wasn't chance that let a culture with no widespread writing system achieve this kind of astronomical precision. For them, tracking the sun's cycle wasn't abstract science. It was the only way to know when to plant and when to harvest on an island where one failed season could mean starvation. This is the turning point of the entire story, and it didn't come from a single storm or a volcanic eruption. It came from human hands and human ambition unfolding quietly across generations. It wasn't a lack of resources that caused the disaster, it was the early abundance itself which let the population explode. Some estimates suggest that at its peak, the island supported 10 to 15,000 people, several times the few thousand Roggeveen encountered in 1722. Forests were cleared for canoe timber, for housing, and most critically, for the log rollers and ropes needed to drag multi-ton Moai statues for miles from the quarry to the coast. But there's a lesser-told character in this collapse story. The Polynesian rat, brought along by the settlers themselves, whether by accident or as a stored food source. With no natural predator on the island, the rat spread uncontrolled and devoured the giant palm seeds, meaning the forest couldn't regenerate even once humans stopped cutting it down. This is the kind of paradox that keeps repeating on this island. It wasn't purely human greed that erased the forest, it was an ecological chain reaction that no one at the time could have foreseen. Try to imagine you're a young stonemason living in the final stretch of this era. You grew up hearing that your great-grandfather once built canoes large enough to fish for tuna out on the open ocean. But by your time, there isn't even enough timber left to build a small rowboat. You still carry on the work your ancestors handed you, carving statues for your clan, even knowing that every log used to drag a Moai is a tree that will never grow back. That's the hardest position in this entire story. None of them were the villain, and yet all of them, generation after generation, were quietly accelerating the very collapse that no single person had the power to stop alone. The clearest evidence of this sudden collapse is still sitting exactly where it was left to this day at the Rano Raraku quarry. Nearly 400 statues remain unfinished, some barely roughed out, others carved down to the finest facial detail, but never freed from the rock face. Those unfinished statues are like a snapshot of the exact moment the whole social system ground to a halt. Once the forest was gone, the effects rippled outward. No more timber for deep-sea fishing canoes, so the major seafood supply collapsed. No tree cover left to hold the soil, so wind erosion accelerated. And critically moving, the Moai, those symbols of status and pride, became nearly impossible. According to oral tradition, still told on the island, conflict between two groups known as the Long Ears and the Short Ears came to a head at a defensive ditch on the Poik Peninsula, where one side was driven back and nearly wiped out. While modern archaeologists still debate how literally to take this story, it survives as a vivid metaphor for what actually happened. Clans began fighting over the dwindling farmland and remaining resources, and this internal conflict is linked to the toppling of hundreds of statues right where they once stood. The greatest tragedy here isn't that the forest disappeared, it's that the very statues that had once united the community became the reason it tore itself apart. And then came a second disaster, this one from outside, more brutal than anything the island had ever done to itself. In 1862, Peruvian slave raiders landed on the island and abducted roughly half the remaining population, around 1,500 people, including nearly the entire ruling class, and the priests who could read Rongorongo, one of humanity's rare independently invented writing systems. When a handful of survivors were eventually returned, they brought smallpox with them, and the island's population collapsed to just 111 people. By 1877, a demographic crash that nearly erased the entire cultural memory of the Rapa Nui in a matter of decades. To this day, not even the best linguists in the world can fully read that Rongorongo script, because the last people who remembered how never made it back from the slave ships. The most astonishing part isn't that the Moai carving culture collapsed, it's what rose in its place. When raising giant statues was no longer feasible without timber or labor power, on the island shifted away from clans worshipping stone ancestors toward an entirely new cult centered on the creator god, Make One, that handed leadership of the entire island for a full year to whoever won a life or death annual competition held at the stone village of Orongo, perched on the cliffs of the Ranokau volcano. The winner was crowned Birdman of the Year, and the chief who had sent him became the island's supreme ruler for the next 12 months. It wasn't that the Rapa Nui suddenly abandoned their belief in ancestors, it's that they found an entirely new way to sustain their power structure once the old method raising giant statues was no longer sustainable. The tradition lasted until the mid-1800s, when Christian missionaries arrived on the island and brought the last competition to an end. Dawn on Rapa Nui doesn't arrive with an alarm clock. It arrives with the sound of sea wind hitting the cliffs of Ranokau and roosters crowing across Hangaroa, the island's only town home to nearly all of its roughly 750 residents. By 5:30 in the morning, fishermen are already pushing small boats out to sea, racing to use the calm water before the trade winds pick up by midday, because the island has no natural deep water harbor, so every boat has to fight the swell from the moment it leaves shore. How does a community keep depending on the sea when the island itself doesn't even have a real harbor? The answer lies in adaptation. Fishermen here learn to read the swell and accept a level of daily risk that almost nowhere else has to. By 7 a.m., children are walking or biking to one of the island's handful of schools where they learn both Spanish and the native Rapa Nui language side by side. By midday, the small market in central Hangaroa is busy, with people selling freshly caught tuna, sweet potatoes and bananas crops that trace back to the original Polynesian settlers. But there's a paradox. Everyone who lives here understands almost everything else. Fuel meat, even toilet paper, has to be flown or shipped in from Chile, more than 700 kilometers away, with only a handful of commercial flights a week, connecting the island to the rest of the world. Living in the most remote place on Earth doesn't mean living apart from the global market. It means depending on it more fragilely than almost anywhere else. By dinnertime, families typically gather around meals that mix fresh seafood with ingredients imported from Chile, a table that perfectly captures the island's central paradox: half self-sufficient, the way their ancestors were 1,000 years ago, half dependent on a single weekly flight from a distant continent. In the late afternoon, as the light turns amber gold over the grassy hillsides, visitors and locals alike gather at Ahu Tongariki, where 15 restored Moai stand in a row, backs to the sea, watching over the community behind them. For the Rapa Nui, this isn't a lifeless outdoor museum. For For the descendants of the families who carved them, each statue still carries the spirit of an ancestor, a concept called mana, and their 20th century restoration is seen as an act of restoring the family's own honor. When night falls, there's no city glow to compete with the sky, and Rapa Nui becomes one of the clearest stargazing spots on Earth. Locals still point out to their children the same constellations their ancestors once used to cross the open ocean and find this island 1,000 years ago. But there's a completely different version of a day on this island, one that happens for just 2 weeks each year in early February, when the Tapati Rapa Nui festival turns all of Hungaroa into a living stage. The whole community splits into 2 sides, each backing a young woman competing to become the Tapati Queen. Through a string of traditional trials, outrigger canoe racing, open water swimming, while towing a bundle of bananas, and the island's most extreme sport of all hakape, where young men slide down a near vertical hillside on nothing but 2 lashed-together banana trunks, reaching speeds that can hit 80 kilometers an hour. It isn't just tourist entertainment that has kept this festival alive for more than 50 years. It's that this is the one time each year a community that nearly lost its entire cultural memory gets to teach its children exactly who they are and how their ancestors once lived. Today, Rapa Nui faces a modern version of the exact equation that once destroyed its ancestors. Rising sea levels are eroding the Aishu platforms that have held the Moai upright for centuries, forcing local authorities to consider relocating some monuments, an act many Rapa Nui see as almost as painful as the toppling their own ancestors once carried out during the conflict era. On top of that, South Pacific currents carry a different kind of debris to the shores of the most isolated island on Earth. Plastic waste drifting thousands of kilometers, washing up on beaches once considered among the most pristine in the world. Proof that no place, no matter how remote, is truly separate from the rest of the planet anymore. Alongside the push for self-governance, international scientists and the Rapa Nui community now collaborate more closely than ever to reconstruct the island's own history, from full 3D surveys of nearly 1,000 statues to studies of ancient agriculture, showing that their ancestors adapted with sophisticated stone mulch farming techniques rather than simply collapsing into chaos the way Western textbooks described for decades. It isn't outsiders arriving to rescue a lost culture. For the first time, the story of Rapa Nui's collapse is being rewritten by the very descendants of the people who lived through it. Ironically, the very isolation that shaped the island's entire history is now shrinking, not through air routes or shipping lanes, but through satellites. In late 2022, Easter Island became one of the most remote places on Earth to get high-speed satellite internet, letting students take classes with teachers on the mainland and letting families video call relatives thousands of kilometers away without relying on the slow public connection that existed before. It isn't that modern technology has erased the island's geographic isolation. Its position in the middle of the Pacific hasn't changed at all. It's that, for the first time in history, that distance no longer means being completely cut off from the rest of the world. Young people keep leaving for work and study on mainland Chile, aging the indigenous population, while the number of visitors, the island's main economic lifeline, keeps climbing so fast that this small island now has to cap how many people are allowed to set foot on it each day. If there's one thing Rapa Nui's story teaches more clearly than almost any other islands, it's this: civilizations rarely collapse from a lack of resources. They collapse because no one realizes the line between pride and depletion until it's already been crossed. But this story doesn't end in ruins. The statues that were once toppled are standing again, not by some miracle, but through the hands of the very descendants of the people who knocked them down, determined to rebuild their ancestors' honor themselves. Perhaps like every home humans have ever called their own, this smallest and loneliest island in the vast ocean is still proving something simple. A place isn't home because it's perfect. It's home because we choose again and again to stand it back up. And every afternoon, as the light sweeps across faces carved 500 years ago, something in this story keeps repeating itself. Those statues were never really guarding the sea. As many people assume, they stand with their backs to the ocean, their gaze fixed forever on the community behind them. Perhaps that's the final and most important lesson Rapa Nui leaves us with, whether disaster comes from within, by human hands, or from outside, as rising seas and drifting plastic now do the one thing always worth protecting was never the monument itself. It was the small community, still living, breathing, and still telling its own story in the most remote corner of the world. If Easter Island's story made you want to discover more of the world's forgotten places, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. And if you know another island or region that deserves to be told this way, drop its name in the comments. It might just become the next episode of this channel.